Welcome to Food for Thought. My name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. I'm your host. You can find me at joyfulvegan.com. And remember, this podcast is listener supported. So if it's something you value and you'd like to enjoy some perks, head over to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, or just go to joyfulvegan.com and click on the donate button. If you're a listener on Apple Podcasts, you can become a subscriber there for bonus episodes. And thank you so much in advance for supporting and for subscribing and for listening and for leaving ratings and reviews. Today's episode is Vegan in Japan, Part 1. We made history. No doubt about it. We just ran the first ever vegan group trip to Japan, and we ran 2 back to back because the first one sold out in 36 hours, I think it was. And so we added a second one, and that one sold out, and I just got back. It was a feat. It was a heavy lift. It was a huge success. And it was thanks to my amazing friends, Bridie and Seb at World Vegan Travel, that this happened. They made this happen. Now, they're going to also say that it was thanks to some incredible support on the ground in Japan itself, and we're going to talk about that. And we'll come back to those people specifically because they will be a resource for you if you don't join us on a future trip to Japan. But in short, I'm really proud of what we accomplished. I'm really proud of what we did. And it was an absolute joy and pleasure and honor to go to Japan myself because it's a place I've been wanting to go to for a very long time, decades, I want to say. And it was a dream come true for me. And I think it was a dream come true for a lot of people as well. So we don't have the dates for Japan 2025 up yet, but the booking link for Japan 2025 should be up soon. And I hope you can join us. Also, just to get the trips out of the way, we have 1 room left for Rwanda, November 2024, and a couple spots left for our incredible June trip to Northern Italy, and that's also June 2024. And if you haven't heard, because this happened very quickly, we are going to Croatia and we're taking you with us. We are hosting a luxury yacht vacation on the Adriatic. And because it sold out in a few days, I'm not kidding you when I say this, it sold out in a few days. We offered a second trip just following the first one. However, we have to decide very, very, very soon whether we're going to do the second one because it requires just some finagling, some upfront costs, and we're not sure we're going to do the second one unless we get that one filled as well. And so if you are interested and you'd like to join us, book today through our early adopter pricing. It's a special way we're doing these trips because they're unique. And if you want to join us on a luxury yacht for a week in the Adriatic and going from Dubrovnik and to Split and doing some land excursions, and it's going to be incredible. You can go to joyfulvegantrips.com. You can click on that trip and see all the details for the itinerary that we have right now. And this trip uniquely, it has different levels of cabins because it's a boat, right? And so typically our rooms are all pretty much the same. It's the same pricing. So for the special early adopter pricing that we're doing, it's a first come, first serve, and the price is the same whether you book the upper cabin, main deck, lower cabin. It's all the same. And that will change when we exit out of the early adopter pricing. So go to the website, you'll see what I'm talking about, but it's kind of a really amazing, unique thing we're doing. And we're going to Croatia. So if you'd like to be part of this inaugural trip to Croatia, just head over to joyfulvegantrips.com. Now, our trips to Japan were inaugural trips to Japan. And I am so amazed by and proud of what we did because, as you'll hear in this episode, it's a unique place in terms of what to look for, what to be aware of. And what I'm going to be sharing with you is all of these tips for going to Japan yourself. Of course, you don't have to come on a joyful vegan trip. So I want to be able to give you the resources and details about what to look for, what to ask for when you're traveling. Now, like I said, this is part 1. In part 2, we're going to talk about specific foods, specific dishes like ramen and okonomiyaki and udon and soba and mochi and a ton of other specific foods. We're going to talk about specific regional cuisine, and we're going to talk about, of course, getting these wonderful traditional Japanese foods and newer modern Japanese foods without animal products. But in part 1, I'm going to talk about kind of general ideas and general thinking about being vegan in Japan. And I'm going to talk about some of the history of plant-based eating in Japan. And I think it's going to be really interesting for you. I know it's interesting to for me to know, and the research I've done is really fascinating in terms of the history of again, eating animals and the history of eating plants in Japan. I'm also going to break out some specifics into their own episodes. I'm going to have a specific episode on ramen because ramen, there is so much to say, and I have to say it was kind of like our experience when we went to Vietnam. When we went to Vietnam, well, this is a different part of the experience. I've always loved Japanese cuisine. I was not a fan of Vietnamese cuisine. And I wasn't a big fan. A lot of it was because any Vietnamese restaurant I've ever gone to in the United States, they're very meat heavy. However, having gone to Vietnam and in having enjoyed a lot of the, specific Vietnamese cuisine specific to the regions and the areas we were in, but also something like pho that I had never had in the United States because every time I had looked at pho, it was all very meat heavy. Having had vegan pho, I fell in love with pho. And when we got home, I just went deep dive into cooking it, making it, and finding restaurants around us that have vegan pho and vegan options. And it's been wonderful. And of course, we live in California, so there are huge Asian communities all over the place, whether we're talking about, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a ton. So it's been really fun for us and really easy for us. Well, the case with Japan, it's not that I didn't already eat Japanese food prior to going to Japan, but there were certain things that I did not understand, and there were certain things that I wasn't a huge fan of. So for instance, ramen in the United States, when we think of ramen, we think of cheap food that we can get at 7-Eleven, cheap ramen packets, and it's great for college students because it's cheap and it's easy. But I now understand ramen like I never understood ramen before. And so I can't wait to share ramen with you. And I'm going to do an entire episode on ramen. So look out for that. I may break out other foods, specific foods as well. I'm also going to do an episode specifically on animal issues in Japan. So we're going to talk about that. But today we're going to talk about the history of plant-based eating in Japan, how prevalent it is, if veganism is even a thing in Japan, kind of general things to ask for and look for when you're in Japan, and a lot more. Now, as always, you get even more if you are a member of my Patreon community. So please be sure to become a member today over at patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau or at joyfulvegan.com. Patreon supporters, patrons get specific resources, suggestions. I'm going to give you specific restaurants. And of course, you get the transcript of this episode. That all starts at $10 a month. So for only $10 a month, you get so much. And you know that this podcast continues because of you. And you also get additional perks at higher levels. So head over there today and become a supporter. So let's start with some high level ideas about the culinary scene in Japan. Ideas that will frame our topic today, and ideas that I'm going to keep pointing to as I go on, both in this episode and in subsequent episodes. So number one thing I found very interesting while I was in Japan, I noticed this, but certainly in the research I did before we left and since we've come back, is how regional the cuisine is in Japan. It's not really surprising, right? I mean, I think most countries have this. We talked about this a lot as it relates to Italy. And in some ways, it's kind of a misnomer to even talk about Italian cuisine because Italian cuisine is so regional. And if you remember, if you listen to the 4-part series I did on the different cuisines of Italy, broken up by Southern Italy, Central Italy, Northern Italy, And with a little bias on my part, I broke out one episode on Tuscan cuisine, even though it's part of Central Italy, because not only is it my favorite, and I get to do that, it's my podcast, but it's one that I know best, but also because I think it's the most well-known cuisine, Tuscan cuisine. Now, we can do this with Japan as well. And I was very struck by how regional the cuisine was, each cuisine having its distinct, cultural identity. And it was really interesting. So we're going to talk about that, especially when we get into part two, when we talk about specific foods and specific ingredients, specific cuisines, specific ways of eating. We're going to talk about that in part two, especially. But that's something to keep in mind because I'll be mentioning that a lot. The second thing to say in terms of kind of framing Japanese cuisine is I knew Japanese culture places a strong emphasis on food. But as I was doing research and watching Japanese documentaries and feature films that focus kind of on food prior to going and since returning from Japan and seeing it for myself when I was there, it became apparent to me pretty quickly that this is a foodie culture through and through, which entails not only appreciating food as sustenance, but also as an art form and as a means of social connection. And in some cases, like with other things that can be taken too far, there's a bit of reverence for certain foods and a fetishizing of certain foods that certainly lends itself to some affectionate satirizing of this reverence for food because there's such a foodie aspect. And we do this all the time. I mean, we can make fun of foodies here in the US, and we do, and I do. Think about it the way people make fun of people drinking wine. And we do this ourselves. I mean, I'm shocked sometimes that we sound like a parody when we are drinking wine, especially when we go to wineries and, we're there to really understand the different types of wine and the different grapes that were grown and the different types of wine we're drinking. And we really do sound like a parody when we're talking about the different taste elements, etc. And of course, we can do this around food. And this has been done by, especially the Japanese themselves, especially in movies that will satirize this foodie aspect. And we'll talk more about that again in the specific episode. We will talk about it especially in the specific episode on ramen. So it was really interesting to really get a handle on that. And on the positive side, I mean, this reverence for food really comes from a very deep appreciation for the quality and the freshness and the presentation of food. And many Japanese people are passionate about this, about exploring different culinary experiences, whether it's trying traditional dishes or seeking out regional specialties or indulging in innovative cuisine. And we experienced this a bit on our trip. If for those of you listening, remembering that very modern experience we had when we were in Kanazawa. And so it's really interesting to see this enthusiasm for food extending beyond just eating. It has to do with the preparation and the cooking techniques and of course food related rituals and ceremonies. And we see that of course in the tea ceremony, for instance. Now I appreciate this greatly. And of course, there's some aspects of this I have a really hard time with because a lot of it involves animals who are harmed. So we'll talk about that in subsequent episodes. Another observation, a third observation I want you to keep in mind in terms of framing the way to think about Japanese cuisine, and it will come up a lot in our conversation here, is that Japan is very good at adopting and adapting elements from other cultures, incorporating them into its own unique traditions and practices, and sometimes improving upon them. So you're going to see this a lot in terms of the food we're going to be talking about, especially when we get to the specifics. And in a moment, when I talk a bit about the history of plant-based eating in Japan, we're going to talk about that as well. But some examples of non-cuisine related instances where Japan takes something from other cultures and refines it and makes it their own. For instance, Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism originated in India, and of course, it was picked up in China and in Korea, and it came to Japan by way of China, but through Korea, really, the first monk a Buddhist monk who came to Japan was Korean. So you see that. I mean, Buddhism is such a huge aspect of Japanese culture, and it has had a huge influence on Japanese culture. And it didn't originate in Japan. We see it in baseball. I mean, baseball came from the U.S. and the Japanese took it and made it their own. And baseball is a huge aspect of Japanese culture. You can see it in the Japanese writing system, whose characters come from China. And I'm not going to lie, you can see it in toilets. Toilets. The Japanese, they just improved the toilet like beyond, right? I mean, they were inspired by innovations in Western countries, but they took toilets to a whole other level. We're talking heated seats and built-in bidets and automated flushing systems. I have to say, we travel to Europe a lot, and as an American, I do not like and do not embrace the bidet system in Italy, in France. I'm sorry, but I don't want to get off the toilet and go to a different mechanism, straddle it, and it's just not for me. But what the Japanese did was build the bidet into the seat, into the toilet. And so we have a Toto. Toto is the big brand that the Japanese, it's a Japanese brand, and you've heard of Toto. All of our toilets are Toto. In fact, all of our toilets are Toto because they just make really good toilets, but only one of them has the bidet. And when we renovated that bathroom, which we call David's bathroom, but we both use it, and I especially use that bathroom more now that we have the Toto bidet, we're going to put a Toto bidet in my bathroom as well. And it just requires having an outlet and making sure, you can get the hot water to run to that toilet as well, because yeah, we're talking like the bidet has, warm water. Okay. And the heated seat, it's really a game changer. And we don't live in like a freezing climate, but oh man, it's just amazing. And I will tell you this. Okay. I'm going to say one more thing about toilets because I'm not here to talk about toilets, especially in a food episode. But it was really fun being in Japan and seeing everybody else experience the Toto toilet experience because it really is above and beyond. And Toto toilets are in every public bathroom, mostly every public bathroom, in train stations, in just public parks. You'll get the most incredible, every seat is heated, and it's a wonderful experience. But what was really wonderful, I will say this, before we left for Japan, our Toto bidet, we've had it for now, I think about 5 years, and it broke. It just stopped working. So the seat wasn't heated, the bidet part wasn't working. And so, we looked, we're like, okay, it's going to be another $800-900 to get another bidet. And instead of doing that, of course, we've talked about this in the zero waste mentality, can we get it fixed? And so we reached out to Toto, and I don't even know that we have a lifetime warranty. I don't even think it was because we have a lifetime warranty. I think their customer service is just really high. Maybe we have a lifetime warranty, but they said, send it back to us. If we can fix it, we'll fix it. And if not, we can't. And it was $150, I think, to do this. I mean, we took the risk, of course, because if they couldn't fix it, we'd still pay the $150, I think. But they gave us a label. We packed it up. They gave us a label and we sent it to them, and then they fixed it. It was like a sensor issue, and they sent it back. So it was here when we returned. So the bidet is connected again because there were a few weeks prior to leaving that it wasn't working, and it was very noticeable. It was very noticeable. So once you have one, you can never go back. And it was incredible. So that's an example where the Japanese are very good at taking something and just 10xing it. And they do this a lot. And they do this a lot with cuisine. So those are some things to keep in mind as a frame. Number one, that Japanese cuisine is very regional. Number two is that there's a strong emphasis on food, and the Japanese are very much foodies, and they use food not just as sustenance, but as an art form and as a way to connect. And number three, that the Japanese do take cuisines or elements, ingredients from other cultures and other countries and make it their own, and then just, really go deep with it. So remember those things as we continue to talk about Japanese cuisine. So hopefully that's a helpful frame. Now let's talk about culinary history of Japan, especially as it relates to the consumption of plants and animals. Now, this is food for thought. It's not history for thought, but you know me. I love me my food history. I love me my history, but I love me my food history. And honestly, I don't think you can talk about a place's history without talking about food, and you can't talk about food without talking about history. So we have to talk about history. We have to talk about this as they connect with each other. And I think all of this is going to be helpful as we talk about why certain foods are eaten, why some foods are forbidden, why the habit of eating land animals is a relatively recent phenomenon in Japan, why eating plant-based in Japan is as old as the hills, but vegan as a concept is new. So all of this is going to make sense talking about it in this context. So I'm going to talk about this a bit related to the way Japan tends to be broken up, the history of Japan tends to be broken up into different periods. So let's start with the ancient era. There's not a lot to say. The ancient era, we're talking about prehistoric to about 710 of the Common Era, right? So prehistoric Japan and up to 710, because there's a very specific dates that then take Japan to a different era for different reasons. So number one, Japan's ancient era spans from prehistoric times to the establishment of the Nara period in 710. And like many places in the world, the diet of the indigenous people, in Japan's case, it's the Yayoi people, the Jomon people, it was primarily based on hunting and fishing and gathering plants. And these early inhabitants relied on certainly the natural resources of the Japanese archipelago, which of course being an archipelago, being a series of islands, that would be aquatic animals. So they certainly ate a lot of aquatic animals as well as wild animals, but they gathered a lot of plants, roots, nuts, and berries. So that's typical of prehistory in Japan. Then moving on to the Nara and Heian periods, we're talking from 710 to 1185, so very early medieval period. These periods are significant because it's during these periods that Buddhism was introduced to Japan. And Buddhism, as I said earlier, significantly influenced dietary practices in Japan. Buddhism was introduced to Japan in the 6th century. And it came primarily through cultural and diplomatic exchanges with neighboring countries, as I said, China and Korea. And as you know, Buddhist teachings advocate for vegetarianism because Buddhist teachings promote compassion for all living beings. And as a result, vegetarian cuisine became prevalent, especially among Buddhist monks and members of the aristocracy. And in fact, in 675, the emperor at the time, Emperor Tenmu, instituted a decree prohibiting the consumption of various animals, various meat from different animals, including chicken, cows, dogs, horses, and monkeys, as well as small fish during specific months of the year from April 1st to September 30th. Emperor Tenmu was a prominent supporter of Buddhism, and we're going to come back to this. So it was an official decree. Now, we've talked a lot. You've heard me talk a lot about Christianity recently and the prevalence of Christianity and in the Christian church over the centuries, choosing certain times of the year for abstaining from animal products. And this cannot be said enough. I mean, it was so significant because, for a very long time, there was not a separation between church and state. And so the leaders, the people who held the power, through so much of the Middle Ages, especially once Christianity took hold, they were Christian. And so that had a huge impact on the majority of the population. So when Christian leaders were asking Christians themselves to not consume animal products, we're talking about 90% of the population, especially in the Middle Ages. And so eventually we have this separation of church and state. And so now it would be only Christians who are asked to do that. And the abstaining from meat, dairy, and eggs has been whittled down to, not eating, you know, fish on one day of the year. I mean, it's whittled down a lot, but there was a long time where people were abstaining from meat, dairy, and eggs because of Christianity in the West. Well, in the East, especially here in Japan, because again, the emperor at the time would have had the power to say we are Buddhist. It was an official decree, and that meant that affected the majority of people. Now, there was a Shinto religion. You're going to hear me talk about Shinto religion, which is the native religion among the Japanese, and that has to do with the idea that the divine is in all of nature. And so that also impacts people's eating habits, but not as much as Buddhism does. Buddhism is really affecting people's eating in the sense of not eating animals. Now, here we are, the emperor is not saying don't eat all animals. It's a decree prohibiting the consumption of certain animals, chickens, cows, dogs, horses, and monkeys, and some small fish, and only for specific periods of the year. But this is impacting the culture greatly. So we're going to come back to that. During this time, again, we're talking 710 to 1185. This is also when the adoption of rice cultivation techniques come from China and led to the widespread cultivation of rice, which became a staple food in Japan. You can't think of Japanese cuisine without thinking about rice. Also, chickens had been introduced to Japan from China at this time with the advent of rice farming, but duck breeding, which was present in China, was not introduced yet. So chicken meat was prohibited under Tenmu's original 675 edict, as I said, but birds such as pheasants and wild ducks were not, so that they were consumed. They continued to be consumed. Now, because of the rise in the cultivation of rice, you have rice-based dishes like sushi and rice cakes, mochi. So we're talking about pretty ancient. I mean, these going back, a long time, 1500 years we're talking about. So they started to gain popularity, and they were complemented by seasonal vegetables and seasonal fruits and tea. So tea was introduced to Japan from China in the 9th century. So in this period, this Nara and Heian period, in the 9th century, tea came from China. Buddhist monks returned from study trips to China. They were in China to study and to practice in their monastic way. And they came back from China with tea seeds, and they brought back the knowledge of tea cultivation and preparation back to Japan. And so this marked the beginning of Japan's tea culture, which continues to thrive today, which is why, one of the reasons I have been very excited to go to Japan. Now, the tea I drink is mostly Chinese, to be honest, but I do drink a lot of Japanese as well. And so people who were with us on the trip would have enjoyed genmaicha, sencha, matcha. So these are all Japanese teas. And I'm going to do an episode on tea. You know I am. And I'm going to talk about the different teas in Japan, the different teas in China. And I'm going to talk about tea ceremonies, because the tea ceremony did not start in Japan. It started in China and in Korea and was brought to Japan. So again, when we associate tea ceremonies, we probably think about Japan. When we think about tea ceremonies, we think about Japan. So we associate we associate tea ceremonies with Japan's. I was about to say we associate Japanese tea ceremonies. That's because I'm so used to saying that, because we don't talk about Chinese tea ceremonies a lot unless you're Chinese, and we don't talk about Korean tea ceremonies a lot unless you're Korean. However, the tea ceremony began in both China and Korea, not Japan. Tofu was introduced to Japan from China at this time, as were noodles. So you can get a sense now of oh, again, we think of ramen as a Japanese food, and it is, but they brought noodles from China. Tofu was from China. Doufu would have been called. So that a lot happened during this period before 1185 in terms of cuisine that we're still enjoying today. Then in 1185, from 1185 to 1603, which is a very significant date in Japanese history, we have the Kamakura and the Muromachi periods. You don't have to remember those names, but we're talking again 1185 to 1603. And during these periods, during this time, which you can see spans, 500 years, during these periods, we saw the rise of the samurai class and increased trade with China and Korea, which introduced even more new ingredients and cooking techniques. Now, despite the continued prominence of Buddhist vegetarianism, meat consumption became a bit more common among the general population, especially among the warrior class, but vegetarian dishes remained prevalent in Buddhist temples and aristocratic households, featuring an array of seasonal vegetables. Now we have tofu, soy-based products. You start to see that during those periods. And then we have the Edo period. So the Edo period, a very significant period in Japan from 1603 to 1868. That's also another date you're going to have to remember because it is really significant. So the Edo period was from 1603 to 1868, that saw the emergence of a vibrant culinary culture in Japan's urban centers, particularly in Edo. So Edo is modern day Tokyo. You start seeing street food stalls, sushi restaurants, vegetarian options like tempura. If you follow me on Instagram, you know I would have talked about tempura, which is battered and fried vegetables. Tempura comes from the Portuguese because the Portuguese were there in the 1600s and eventually kicked out, as was Christianity, but that's another story. But what remains from that time, from the Portuguese, from the contact with the Portuguese, is tempura. And here's another example of the Japanese taking something that was brought to them from somewhere else and they just make it their own. So when you think of tempura, do you think of Portugal? No, you think of Japan. This is when we have more sushi and regional cuisines begin to develop, creating these distinct culinary identities, incorporating local ingredients and cooking styles. You start to see this in this Edo period. Buddhist temples continue to serve elaborate vegetarian meals as part of religious rituals and ceremonies, but it was the coming era, the next era, that would bring meat consumption into Japan and embed it into its mostly plant-eating culture. And that was the Meiji Restoration and the modern era. And that is from 1868. So the Meiji Restoration brought significant changes to Japan, including the adoption of Western-style eating habits and the industrialization of food production. So the Meiji Restoration was a pivotal event in Japanese history. It occurred in 1868, and it marked the end of feudal rule and the end of the samurai class and the beginning of modernization and industrialization in Japan. It involved the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate and the restoration of the imperial rule under Emperor Meiji. So that's why it's called the Meiji Restoration. It transformed Japan from a feudal society into a modern nation state, laying the groundwork for its emergence as a major global power in the 20th century and up to the 21st century. In fact, when we were leaving Japan, the Japanese prime minister was at the White House with President Biden. So it's really, really fun to see that connection. And of course, considering the conflict that we had with Japan in the 20th century, it is a wonderful thing that we do not have that conflict anymore. Now, sadly, the modernization and industrialization of Japan also means that the habit of eating meat became common throughout Japan after the 1868 Meiji Restoration. Throughout and before the Edo period that preceded the Meiji Restoration, small amounts of meat, mostly beef, mostly pork, wild game were consumed. I say wild game, quote unquote, wild animals were consumed. But after the Meiji Restoration, there was a swift acceptance and habit forming of meat eating in Japanese society. And that's where we are today. But as you can see from this brief timeline, the habit of consuming meat in Japan is relatively recent, especially consuming it every day. Meat Excluding seafood, excluding aquatic animals, was not a prominent part of Japanese cuisine. And in fact, household meat consumption in Japan did not surpass that of fresh fish consumption until 2007. And because of Buddhist beliefs against meat eating, because of economic factors, because Japan was mostly agrarian, because of all this, prior to the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japanese people were eating mostly plant-based and, of course, aquatic animals. I'm not saying they were eating completely vegetarian. They wouldn't have called it vegetarian, but they were eating mostly plant-based because of these factors. Because Japan had periods of isolationism, which limited contact with the outside world and allowed traditional Japanese culture, including vegetarian dietary practices, to develop and endure without significant external influences, we still have a lot of vegetarian influences today. And as a result, listen to this. Japan has the shortest history of meat consumption among Asian nations. So it's a very interesting history, and I really encourage you to just dive deeply into that because there's a lot more to say, but I want to just give you an overview. Now, I mentioned Buddhism-friendly Emperor Tenmu's ban on consuming certain animals, the chickens, the cows, the dogs, the horses, the monkeys, and the small fish, during specific months of the year. But several animals were excluded from this ban, particularly wild boar and deer. And the consumption of these animals was mostly concentrated in the mountainous regions of northern Japan, as you would imagine, but it was also available in some urban markets. Now, unlike the rearing of livestock, quote unquote, for consumption, which was not widespread in Japan's history, most animals were consumed through hunting rather than farming. And there was a focus on fish and birds. Mammals became increasingly hunted by the emerging samurai warrior class during the Edo period, which were noted for feasting on various animals, such as what you would expect, especially in the higher classes: deer, wild boar, bears, raccoon dogs, and rabbits. And we see this common in other cultures as well. I've talked about this a lot. You're probably sick of hearing me say this, but the consumption of plant foods across the general population, the majority of the population across cultures, across countries, has a much longer history than the consumption of animal flesh and fluids. I mentioned Japan has the shortest, but across the centuries, because the majority of the population was mostly poor, mostly rural, across the world, they were eating plants. Now, once they rise in the ranks and begin making money, they increase their consumption of animal products, of meat, dairy, and eggs. But for the most part, this was really reserved for the higher classes. And so when people say, well, veganism is more expensive, no, no. If you're eating convenience foods, if you're eating highly processed convenience foods, they are more expensive, but that's the case whether you're eating plants or animals. When we're talking about whole foods, plants still remain more affordable than even subsidized meat, dairy, and eggs. Interestingly, speaking of eggs, they were kind of pulled out. I mean, when we think of eggs today, I think we think of them being accessible to kind of the general population because, people could just have chickens or ducks and have eggs at their disposal. But as part of the influence of Buddhism, in the 17th century, consuming chickens' eggs became prohibited. It was another decree. However, sadly, that led to the emergence of duck farming in southwestern Japan as an alternative source of birds' eggs, because apparently we can't live without birds' eggs. But so, you see a ban over here, and then, it means that you're going to make up for it over here. And that's unfortunate. But eventually the ban on eating meat was lifted, but eggs still were viewed as a prestigious health food reserved for the elite. Even after World War II, when the consumption of, lots of other animal products became the norm, chicken's eggs were still considered a luxury item. But as the westernization of the Japanese diet became established in the 1950s, eggs began to be recognized as a common household staple, unfortunately. And sadly, today, Japan is the world's second largest consumer of eggs per capita after Mexico. That is a stat as of 2021. And we saw a lot of eggs, saw a lot of chicken's eggs in Japan when we were there. Today, in contemporary Japan, the majority of people consume a diet that includes a pretty good amount of fish, pretty good amount of meat, pretty good amount of eggs, pretty good amount of dairy products, unfortunately. Now, vegetables and grains are eaten at a higher, I would say there's a higher percentage of vegetables and grains and fruits eaten in Japan than in the United States, for instance. However, they are now starting to consume so much more. I mean, aquatic animals have always been a prominent part of Japanese cuisine because of their extensive coastline, and pork and chicken as well eventually became kind of the meat to eat, especially when the ban was lifted. But now, unfortunately, with again Western foods, pasta, pizza, hamburgers, all of the meat, and they're inundated with the same marketing that we are. There's a heavy promotion of cow's milk consumption. Celebrities are endorsing Kobe beef. And of course, now what's happening is that the Japanese population are getting the same modern diseases like cancer and diabetes and high blood pressure and high blood cholesterol and all of these things like we have in the West. It's very sad that now they're getting the same preventable diseases and relying on medications the way we are in the West. Not a good thing to export, but it is what has happened. And so what is a compassionista to do who visits Japan, who doesn't want all of that stuff, who wants to be able to enjoy this beautiful, incredible country and culture and not eat all those animal products? What is a vegan to do who does not come on a joyful vegan trip? You got to come on a joyful vegan trip because it's kind of amazing. But what are you to do if you do not come on a trip? What are you to eat? What should you be wary of? What are some specialties to look for, depending on the region you're in, that you can enjoy? Uh, Question mark. So in part two, we're going to get into some of those very specific recommendations for what to eat, right? I'm going to talk about the specifics. I keep saying that because there's so much to say, but I had to give you an overview before I get to those specifics, before I get to ramen, before I get to miso, before I get to tofu, before I get to sushi, before I get to udon, before I get to soba, before I get to all those things. I wanted to give you a general overview, right? So we're going to talk about those specifics, but today, I'm going to keep focusing on general recommendations and why it's definitely more of a challenge to eat in Japan as a vegetarian and as a vegan. Now, all of this work is done for you when you are on a joyful vegan trip. That's why we do that. And I'm going to be really honest. Some of the things that we experience on our trips are not things you can replicate. And I am not saying this to you in any way to sell the trips, but it is the advantage of traveling as a group. We have the numbers, we have the leverage to be able to say, we've got two groups of 16, 17 people, actually 20 when you include all of us. So, the hosts and the tour leaders. So 20 people. We've got two groups of 20 people. You have more leverage when you do that. But also that's part of what we do on these trips is we want people to experience the best of the best and to experience things they wouldn't otherwise experience. And again, we have the leverage. So there were cases where, there were things that we did and people are like, oh, on social media, how do I get that? What's the name of that restaurant? What's the name of that chef? Well, we hired them specifically for our group. And so you can do that if you can hire someone and pay that for just one person. But there are some things that you don't get when you're just an individual. However, there's a lot you can get, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So if you are interested in the Joyful Vegan Japan, go to joyfulvegantrips.com. Make sure you're on the mailing list because it is first come, first serve, and we already have that list growing. When Japan was closed down for so long during COVID, they were closed down for 3 years and closed down to everybody else coming into that country. Our list was growing and it went to 350 people. That's why we sold out so quickly. And so a lot of those people are still on the list who didn't make it to the 2024 trips, but that list is now growing even more having done Japan and as we look forward to 2025. So go check that out. Now, In terms of animal-derived things to be aware of, there are a few things to keep in mind. So I can't just say this, and that without giving you another kind of way to think about this, because there's a part of me that wants to just say, use all of the advice I've ever given you. Use the advice, that I've given you, which is, ask for what you want, be respectful, be kind, and they'll change things for you. Not the same. It's not the same in Japan. So what I want to say is, assume like you would anywhere else that baked goods are made with chickens, eggs, and assume that soups have animal-based broth. Fine. Okay, that's pretty typical anywhere. But there are differences that make Japan unique. There just are. So in the West, in the United States, in Western countries I travel to, typically I can ask for a change in a menu item and have no problem getting it, right? Especially here in the US. Hey, don't put cheese on my salad. Don't put dairy on my salad. Can you use soy milk instead of dairy milk? Can you replace the chicken with vegetables? Can you take out the chicken? Things like that. Generally not an issue. But in Japan, not a thing. Much more difficult. Much more difficult. In Japan, it's generally uncommon to request changes to a menu due to cultural norms and culinary traditions. I mentioned earlier about the food culture aspect, and this is the foodie culture aspect, and this is kind of an example of that, because Japanese cuisine places a strong emphasis on the chef's expertise and the balance of flavors and ingredients meticulously chosen for each dish. So making alterations to a dish may be seen as questioning the chef's skills or disrupting the intended harmony of flavors. Now, I have experienced this in the United States, and to be honest, I really guffaw at it because I remember this experience when I was at a pizza restaurant here in Oakland. And, California has this huge foodie culture that comes from, just Japan. It actually comes from like Italy, or it comes from this mentality of the chef knowing what is right. And, the customer knows less and shouldn't tell the chef what to do. And I really do have a hard time with that because I find it so snooty and snobby. And I have had experiences like this here in California where I have been tempted to walk out of a restaurant because the chef, is doing me a favor by, taking the dairy cheese off of my pizza because he knows best and I know less. And I have a hard time with that. However, I'm seeing it through a different lens, being sensitive to and mindful of a different culture. But I still want to say there is a little bit of like, yeah, I've been eating for 54 years. I also know what's good. And I'm not even pulling out my, my expertise in cooking. I'm just saying, yeah. And of course, from an ethical standpoint, no. There are things that trump taste. However, this is a cultural thing in Japan. And so Japanese restaurants will also specialize in particular dishes or styles of cuisine, and customers typically trust the chef's judgment in crafting the meal. It is very much a cultural thing. It is a much more conformist society than anything in the United States. We pride ourselves on our individuality. That is not part of the Japanese culture. There's a huge difference between the cultures. I say the United States, but really in the West, where we, especially the United States, though, we pride ourselves on individuality, whereas the Japanese pride themselves on their conformity. So for better or for worse, there are pros and cons to both. So asking for modifications in Japan could be perceived as imposing one's preferences on the establishment, which goes against the cultural emphasis on respect and conformity, period. And so you're going to have a harder time, especially in small family-run restaurants or those in the countryside. But in some cases, especially in, more westernized establishments, those in larger cities, chefs may be accommodating to dietary preferences. So it's always best, as always, whether you're in Japan or in the United States, to approach such requests with humility and politeness and respect and understanding in the in the case of Japan, that the chef's decision is final and reflective of their culinary expertise. And so this is another reason we run trips to Japan. And it might give you a little behind the scenes understanding of the challenges that Bridie and Seb World Vegan Challenge had. World Vegan Challenge, World Vegan Travel had the challenges they had working with our non-vegan hotels and restaurants, because changing things to suit our desires is not a thing, but they did it. So those of you who traveled with us and those of you who are thinking of traveling with us, this is significant. And we're part of the whole process of, scouting and choosing and decision making. And when Bridie and Seb were scouting in Japan and sending David and I their experiences, let me just say, they're heroes. They really are, because what they had to contend with in Japan is very different than what you deal with when you're talking to someone in Italy or even France. So, and I say even France because of their whole foodie culture and cuisine, et cetera, right? So it's a thing. It's a thing that it's not a thing to ask for modifications and get them so readily. So that's something to keep in mind when you're traveling to Japan. Number two, a second thing to keep in mind is while some people speak English, most don't. In Tokyo and Osaka, I mean, you're going to get English speakers somewhat in the larger cities, but for the most part, people speak Japanese, not English. And the word vegan is not really widely understood. It's not a widely understood concept. I want to say to use the word vegetarian just to find common ground, because most people will know that word more than vegan, and then you can kind of go from there. I did find that Google Translate was immensely helpful. Now, I didn't have to use it a lot because we were with the group and we were with, 2 trips back to back. However, there were times before and after the trips that David and I spent time on our own, and I did find that Google Translate was helpful. I often found that when I was asking about something, whether, I didn't say, is it vegan? I wouldn't say that. I don't even think it's helpful to say, is it vegan, when we're talking, to people in the United States and we can speak English to everybody. I don't think it's helpful. I think it's actually really helpful to say something like, I don't eat, I don't eat meat, dairy, and eggs. I don't eat, is there animal broth in this soup? I think that's more helpful than saying, I'm vegan. Do you have vegan items? Because still people don't even in the United States know what vegan means. And there's so many misconceptions. And I will say this as well. I was speaking to Rushka, who was one of our helpers, and I'm going to talk about her a bit more at the end. I was talking to her at the end of our trip, and she was saying something very interesting, and I'll share this with you. And Rushka, if you're listening, I hope I got this right. But one of the things she was saying is that there is more of a trend toward eating more plants, or eating vegan, we'll say, but it's called plant-based. But even the concept of plant-based is still misunderstood. Again, same thing in the United States. We deal with this here as well. However, there is more of an emphasis on eating quote unquote plant-based in Japan that has less to do with ethics or health even, and has more to do with beauty. So that's a thing in Japan. However, even again, I think you see this in the United States and in the West, but plant-based, if something's called plant-based, that doesn't necessarily mean there's no animal products. So if you are using plant-based as an expression to define yourself or identify yourself, or you think it's helpful in terms of communicating what you need and want, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be without animal products. However, when I was in stores, and let's say I was looking for a particular mochi treat, because I love mochi treats so much. And there were specific ones I was looking for, like a daifuku, or I was looking for just particular mochi. I would ask the clerk if, what was in it. And a lot of the times I found that they would kind of, run away, come back with a notebook, and that notebook would have the specific ingredient list of those products. Now, this was something I found in the stores. I found it in kind of more casual restaurants as well. Again, we didn't have fancy sit-down experiences when David and I were on our own, because we were doing that in our trip. So, so it was more like when we were in kind of a casual takeaway place or a cafe or a mochi restaurant or a mochi shop, that I would say, what's in it. And they would come back with this notebook. Now the ingredients were still in Japanese, and it would be specifically in the Japanese characters in kanji. However, I was able to use my Google Translate camera. You know how to do that, right? You can use the camera for just taking a picture of something that's in whatever language, and then you can translate it easily into whatever other language. In this case, I was looking for English, and I could see that the ingredients had or did not have something like eggs or cow's milk, etc. So I did find that that was something that was very helpful. So Google Translate, I think, is helpful. Another helpful thing would be to have a pre-written note, which can be also helpful in smaller, less visited villages in the countryside, but also in smaller restaurants or izakayas, the bars. I'll talk about izakaya in a moment, that have only Japanese menus and cater to Japanese, to locals, and where people would not speak English. I think the note could be helpful. As I said, I think it's helpful to be specific, say exactly what you don't eat and exactly what you do eat. I don't think it's helpful to say, I'm vegan. Do you have anything that's vegan? That's too presumptuous, and it's not going to be helpful. But if you say something like, and again, this could be in the kanji script for them to read, and you can get help doing this, but you could just use Google Translate, but have that note on hand with you. And it could say something like, I don't eat meat, seafood, dashi made with bonito or katsuo, like fish flakes. I don't eat milk products, eggs, or honey, but I do eat vegetables, mushrooms, soybeans, seaweed, fruit, buckwheat, wheat, rice, tofu, shoyu, right, soy sauce, etc. So it's helpful to do that. And I think at that point, you still will get maybe another staff member coming over to confirm, and the chef may be able to make something for you. It might not be a gourmet meal, but it might be something that would be edible and enough for you to have the sustenance you need to go visit more temples and shrines and mountains and sites and etc. So that is something I think would be helpful. Use Google Translate, and also maybe have a note on hand. And third, the final thing I would say to just keep in mind when you're looking for specific things is that there are things, and I think this is the case wherever you are. I mean, you're vegan, you know what to do, is just kind of presume that things you wouldn't expect to have animal products in them, to have animal products in them, including things like bread. Now, it's the case, I think, anywhere where you get your sliced breads, kind of sliced bread in packaging, bread, processed, would probably have animal derivatives in them. But I did see that also, things that you wouldn't expect, like a baguette kind of bread, like a bakery kind of bread, would also have animal milk, which you wouldn't expect, but just ask. Now, we went to a really lovely bakery the last day of our trip. I'll share the name with you. This isn't only going to be for my Patreon supporters. There's a couple names I'm going to give you, but for the most part, if you want specifics, just again, become a supporter and you'll get all of these kinds of specifics, which is the case, for other episodes I do as well. It's one of the perks. And also you're just supporting this podcast, which thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So there's a bakery in Tokyo, in a neighborhood in Tokyo called Akasaka. Favorite neighborhood, by the way. Favorite neighborhood. Now, I've only been to like 5, but but still, I really loved Akasaka. A lot of vegan-friendly shops there. One of the best vegan ramen I had in the whole of our trip there. And now I'm I'm on a quest for just the best ramen. So go to Akasaka. And it wasn't far from where our hotel was. And so if in the future we're staying at the same hotel, I will recommend this to you if you come on our trip. But there was a bakery called Akasaka Bakery Soiba. And they had several of the baguettes and the batards marked vegan. So we got a gorgeous batard, delicious. For the flight, I would have gotten more if it wasn't our last day, so that I could just had more. The bread looked gorgeous. And they marked a lot vegan, which is not really common. You don't see that. So it was really cool to see. And I think it's a real indication that we're seeing more of this in Japan, which is really exciting. You're going to see this in larger cities like Tokyo or Osaka. I think it's still rare at this point, but you will see it. And I think it's really exciting. The point is, assume there's animal products in something you wouldn't expect there to be animal products in. Just ask. You might be pleasantly surprised. They might bring you an ingredients list to learn that it is suitable for joyful vegans. So here are some other specific things to look for. Here are some specific things to look for. Dashi, I mentioned in that list to give to people. Dashi is a foundational ingredient in Japanese cuisine. It will be the bane of your existence if you are on your own. It's made from fish flakes. It is typically made from fish flakes, also called bonito. But dashi is really just means this broth because it can also be made with kelp, kombu, or dried shiitake mushrooms. So ask. So ask if the broth is made the dashi, but ask if the broth is made with bonito and if it can be made vegetarian. And sometimes it might be able to be. Sometimes they might say, no, it already is. So ask, but presume that if it says dashi, it's going to be made with bonito, it's going to be made with fish flakes, but you may be surprised to find that it may also be made with, well, you want it to be only made with kombu because kombu could also be used to make a meat-based broth, but you want it to be only kombu. So ask, use your Google Translate. Number 2, like everywhere else, you're going to find hidden animal ingredients. So you might be surprised that there's going to be bonito flakes in the miso soup or fish-based sauces in your vegetable stir fry or meat-based broths in your noodle dishes, sometimes bread. So assume and ask about hidden animal ingredients. Now, these animal ingredients on a package are going to show up. You maybe, but sometimes maybe not. So do your best. Being vegan is not about being perfect. You do your best. But there are some animal derived additives that you can see on ingredients list. This would be my third piece of advice. And look for things like gelatin, look for things like fish sauce, look for things like, milk, chicken. Like you'll see that on the ingredients list. Sometimes you won't. You're just going to have to know. There's lots of vegan blogs out there. You can kind of get some tips. But I was told that sometimes soy milk even has like animal, or not even just soy milk, almond milk might have some animal derived derivatives, which is redundant what I just said, but you get the idea. I heard that sometimes potato chips have chicken powder. Yeah, we're crazy. We're just crazy humans. Why? No. Leave my potato chips completely vegan. So you're just going to want to do your best to check. Number 4, oyster sauce is another thing that's commonly used in Japanese cuisine as a flavor enhancer. As we know, that's just about salt. That's just about salt. But you may very well see that in vegetable stir fries, vegetable-based noodle dishes. So check it out. Be cautious. Ask if the oyster sauce can be omitted completely. Side dishes, number 5, traditional side dishes will often contain fish or meat. So whereas we kind of think of side dishes being more vegetable based, not so necessarily. I'm not saying never, but not so necessarily in Japan. But if you look for vegetable-based side dishes, like pickled vegetables is a big thing in Japan. Seaweed salad, wakame, goma will often be, which is a sesame sauce flavored greens. I love goma ai. I love goma ai. But you're going to want to ask about the sesame sauce. So that's side dishes. You're just going to want to double check on that, because gyoza, obviously there's a vegetarian version of gyoza, but there's also going to be a meat-based version, animal meat-based version. And then sweets and desserts. Many Japanese sweets and desserts contain animal products like chicken's eggs, cow's milk, gelatin. So many don't, but you're going to want to ask. And so you'll find lots of mochi with a sweet red bean paste in the center, often vegan friendly, but you're just going to want to ask. And you already know how to do that. Be gracious, be respectful, and assume the best. Just assume the best. That's what I have to say about being aware of specific animal products. But what about what you can look for so that you can enjoy a full belly and partake in the cuisine? The first thing I would say, now this isn't going to be everywhere and it's sometimes a bit fancy and maybe even pricey, but I would say look for Shojin Ryori restaurants or menu items. Some restaurants will have like a Shojin Ryori menu at non-vegan restaurants. Now, This concept, the Shojin Ryori, originated in Buddhist monasteries and temples as early as the 6th century. So I mentioned the vegetarian cuisine in Buddhism. It's called Shojin Ryori. Now, my experience with Shojin cuisine goes back a couple decades since we've been in California. Because I've always loved Japanese culture and cuisine, we have had the great pleasure and honor of having Shojin Ryori cuisine at temples here in the San Francisco Bay Area. We've been members of the San Francisco Zen Center in the past. And even if you're not a member, one of their sites, one of their locations is Green Gulch up in Marin County. And there is, well, in that case, there's uh, um, a tea ceremony at the tea house there, and we know everything is already plant-based. The restaurant there at Green Gulch, it's not Shojin cuisine, but it's all vegetarian. David has gone up there for retreats several times. Tassajara, same thing, which is another location as part of the San Francisco Zen Center. But interestingly, there have been commercial, open to the public, and trendy Shojin restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area. Our favorite was one, and it was really my entrance into liking mushrooms. I always call my gateway mushroom was a shiitake mushroom, and it was at a Shojin restaurant called Medicine. It was a couple decades ago now, and maybe 15 years ago. And it sounds like a terrible name for a restaurant. It was a really cool space. It was in San Francisco, kind of near the business district, the financial district, which was really cool. So it was very crowded during lunchtime. And it was a beautiful experience. The food was fantabulous. They have since closed, and it was really a shame. But we have now Shizen in San Francisco. I wouldn't say that it's, traditional Shojin, but it comes out of the Shojin tradition. And if you come to San Francisco or if you live in the Bay Area, you have to go to Shizen. The food is fabulous. It's the best sushi you're going to ever have. It's just so delicious. And there's now a sister restaurant in Berkeley called, is it called Tane? Tane? Yeah, I just had to check. It's called Tane, vegan restaurant in Berkeley. Some of the same sushi, some of the same dishes you'll have at Shizen. I think it's okay. I'm glad it's there, and I know people love it. And I think we just had a bad experience when I was there the first time because the service was horrendous, and I will not go back to a restaurant just because of that. And yes, to those who are listening, even if it's a vegan restaurant, I don't want to just go because it's vegan. I want to go because I'm enjoying the experience that I'm paying for. And that means ambiance, and that means cleanliness, and that means service, and that means food. So you can't just presume that you can get away with being a good restaurant and that people are going to keep coming to your restaurant just because you're vegan if everything else is awful. And the service was awful. Now, I think we went back a second time, and I think I had a better experience, but I need to go back again to have yet another good experience. But anyway, I didn't mean to color your experience. Go there. It's smaller version. It's more casual. It's calling itself an izakaya, which is a kind of more casual experience, restaurant experience in Japan. That's the thing, izakaya. But go check it out. So I feel like there's another. Oh, and then of course in the Bay Area we also have chaya, also kind of in the tradition of Shojin, and we used to go to chaya a lot more. Honestly, I think one of the things that's going to come out of having been in Japan is a resurgence of going back to chaya. We just got out of it just because we don't eat out a lot. And if I'm going to go get sushi, I want it to be at Shizen. But Shizen is a bit more of a higher end experience, but more expensive. Chaya is super casual, cash only, and I loved their food. They started in Berkeley on University Ave, and then I think they also opened a location in the Mission in San Francisco. I don't even know if they're both there yet. It's been so long, and then COVID, so I can't even remember. But the point is, I have had the great experience of enjoying Shojin cuisine, but even kind of. I've had super Shojin, and then I've had kind of commercial Shojin. What you're going to find in Japan is also a mix, but I think it's a good way for you to have a nice experience, a really nice dinner experience, enjoy this very unique experience that's very specific to Japan, very specific to Japanese Buddhism, and also make sure that it's plant-based, make sure it's vegan. So shojin means asceticism as a way to enlightenment, and ryori means cooking. So that's why you have shojin ryori. Shojin. You're going to see this now everywhere because now that it's on your mind, you're going to see it. And ryori is ryori, means cooking. And so Shojin Ryori cuisine, it's not commonly consumed by the general population, even in Japan. Even when there were bans against the consumption of certain animals in Japan, it's not that everyone was vegetarian, and certainly wasn't the case that everyone was eating Shojin Ryori cuisine. It's very specific to Buddhist monastic life. But as I've said, Japan was very plant centered, and so everyone will know what shojin means, and a lot of people will be shojin or eat shojin in Japan, but not everybody. You're not going to find like a shojin restaurant on every corner. It seems to be still very specific to Buddhist temples and specialized vegetarian restaurants, but you can find it. So look for it, and it's beautiful. Like there's principle. I think I might do an episode specifically on shojin. So maybe I'm not going to say any bit more because I think it would be worth doing an episode just on shojin cuisine because it really is very, very unique. Now, I will give you a tip from the hip because we're talking about Shojin Ryori cuisine being specific to Buddhism, and when you're in Japan, you will go to Buddhist temples. You can't avoid it. You'll also go to Shinto shrines. So the shrines are Shinto, and the temples are Buddhist. You will go to both, no doubt. Those beautiful gates that you've seen, right? The Torii gate, that's specific to Shinto. And the temples are specific to Buddhism, but they're often in the same place because Japanese people historically have been both. That's another story. The point is, what I will mention specifically, and I mentioned that Patreon supporters are going to get more details about this, but what I will give you a tip for is around, especially Japanese temples, you will often find vegetarian cuisine. So, not uncommon, right? And when we talk about Buddhism, the hub of Buddhism, because Kyoto was the capital for so long, it's where the power was for so long, and Buddhism really flourished in Kyoto. It also flourished in Kanazawa, which is considered Little Kyoto. So you will find a lot more Buddhist cuisine, Shojin cuisine in Kyoto and Kanazawa. However, when we were in Miyajima, so Miyajima is an island off of Hiroshima, you will find a cafe that's vegetarian. It's associated with a temple there. It's associated with the Daisho In Temple, which is a historic Buddhist temple on the island. So again, Miyajima is off of Hiroshima. There's a cafe called the Hexagon Cafe, and it serves vegetarian, 100% vegetarian, but also lots of vegan dishes. And it includes traditional Japanese cuisine. So you will find that. It's not exclusively Shojin Ryori, but it is exclusively vegetarian and mostly vegan. The food is fabulous, and it's open to the public. We had closed it for both of our groups because we took over the whole restaurant. It's beautiful. It's around this beautiful garden. It's, again, associated with a temple. There's a tea room there as well. It's just lovely. And we closed it down, and people kept coming and asking, because it's the only vegetarian, restaurant on the island. And people kept coming and asking if they could, nope, it's closed. Sorry, closed. But on group one, we invited a German couple to join us because I think two of our travelers didn't come that day. And so we had two spots. And so we invited a German couple, which was really fun. So it's called Hexagon. And I would say in general, also, please go to Miyajima. If you are going to Hiroshima, go to Hiroshima, do the Peace Walk. Absolutely. Which is, this really beautiful and very moving tour that, came after the bombing of Hiroshima, and it's beautiful. So do that, but also do not miss going to Miyajima. It's just a short ferry ride over to Miyajima Island, and it's well worth it. It's famous for its huge, gorgeous, red floating torii gate. It's called floating torii gate. It's right in the water, and it's also famous for deer. I'm going to talk about that another time when I talk about animal issues in Japan. But very quickly, I have to share this with you. Torii, as in a torii gate, is an etymology. So torii is spelled Torii, and I think in Japanese, it might be pronounced torii. So you emphasize that second E. In English, we just tend to say tori, but it would be torii. And it's because the reason it's an etymology is because, well, and the reason that you would emphasize both I's is because the kanji characters, there are two characters in Japanese. The two kanji characters are tori, Tori, which means bird, and the letter I, pronounced E, meaning to be or to reside in the present. So torii is how it would be pronounced. And so the term evokes the image of a perch or a roosting place for birds. And the association with birds stems from the ancient Shinto belief that considered certain birds, particularly crows and birds of prey, as messengers of the gods. So torii gates were believed to be a sacred passage for these divine messengers to enter and exit the human realm, bridging the gap between the sacred and the mundane. And we're going to talk more about this in the animal episode, but according to legend, deer were also considered sacred messengers of the gods and were believed to inhabit areas where the gods resided. So Miyajima Island was regarded as a sacred site where the gods descended to earth, and the presence of deer roaming freely on the island symbolized the spiritual connection between the natural world and the divine realm. So it's a beautiful thing, and it's a beautiful thing that torii is an etymology, so I had to share that with you. Now, speaking of shrines and temples, so I said you'll sometimes find vegetarian restaurants. You will also find a lot of vegetarian snacks around Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. So don't presume it. You're still going to want to ask. You're still going to want to do your due diligence, but you might find mochi snacks that don't have animal products. You might find cucumbers on a stick, which was a thing when we were in, where were we? We were in, I think it was in Kyoto, which sounds weird, but it's delicious. It's like whole cucumbers skewered on sticks, often with the skin left on, seasoned with salt or soy sauce, shoyu, and delicious. Mochi with red bean paste. Candied fruit is a thing. Sugared vegetables are a thing, which it actually reminded me of, kind of growing up in New Jersey and going to the boardwalk. Like carnival food is what we saw everywhere. A lot of street food and a lot of candied fruit, a lot of sugar. But it reminded me of the candied apples I grew up with, the cotton candy. You see that all around. The Japanese love their sweets. They love their sugar. And so you'd see kind of candied everything. Strawberries, candied apples. And we did treat our travelers to sugared sweet potatoes. I love Japanese sweet potatoes. I know you do too. There is a thing where it's street food. It's sugared sweet potatoes. And it was fun. It was actually quite delicious. However, it was a bit sweet and it was a bit sugary. I do prefer sweet potatoes on their own. That's the point. They're so sweet on their own, but it was fun. And when in Rome. So look at food stalls around Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines. You may often find a lot more options suitable for joyful vegans. Another thing to look for, you got Shojin cuisine, you got looking around the temples for snacks and restaurants and looking around the Shinto shrines. Then you got convenience stores. So I know it seems weird, but a lot of Japanese will get their food from shops, from like convenience stores, like 7-Elevens or others that are called family marts. And they will have a wide range of ready-to-eat meals, snacks, food, vegetarian options, like fruit, obviously, salads, onigiri, which is the rice balls, sometimes with beans, and vegetable fillings, and then packaged snacks labeled as vegan. And so you can, just look at the ingredients using the tips I already gave you. One thing to say is that you will find a brand of ramen, like ready-to-eat ramen, where you just add water, by Yamadai is the brand, and you will see it says Yamadai vegan noodles Tantan. You cannot miss it because it says vegan noodles on the front. If you just look that up right now, Yamadai vegan noodles, you will see the package, and it's just a cup, just like a cup of noodles kind of thing, right? and you just add water. It's really good. It's really good. So we took some on the plane with us. So it's something that, if you're traveling back home and you want something for the plane, the food's going to be crap, or if any food at all on the flight back, then get these cup of noodles called vegan noodles. We did that, but we didn't eat them on the plane. We actually ate them when we got home the first night, when we were exhausted and, had been up 24 hours. We didn't feel like cooking anything. We added water in the little seasoned packet. They're actually quite good. And I'm becoming a ramen snob. And I have to say, it was actually quite good. 4, another thing to look for, macrobiotic restaurants. We hear about macrobiotics here in the United States. Don't forget, macrobiotics was founded in Japan, and it was actually a Japanese gentleman who brought macrobiotics to the United States. It's a whole concept of eating. I'm not going to do an episode on it. I'm not going to say much more about it. It's a philosophy, a dietary philosophy that emphasizes whole grains and vegetables and beans and seaweed. It avoids processed foods and refined sugars and animal products. But as you know, here in the United States, I remember when our first trip to Italy, there was a macrobiotic restaurant in Rome. And so, it means that it's going to be more vegetarian friendly. Now, fish is still included in the macrobiotic diet, but it's pretty plant centered. And so in a pinch, this is something you can look for. And so if, it's a concept that's also understood by many Japanese. So you can look for macrobiotic restaurants when you're there. 5, sushi bars. Now, most of the sushi in Japan will be fish-based. And remember, we'll talk about this in the second part of this. Sushi does not mean fish. Sushi just means vinegared rice. And in Japan, it will be mostly fish-based, though some will have some vegetable rolls. You might find a cucumber roll. You might find an avocado roll. You might find an nari, which is the tofu pouch with rice. It's the tofu skin with rice. Like, I love an nari. We get it here all the time. So you might find some vegetable nigiri sushi, but it really depends on where you are. So just ask beforehand, and you're going to find it in the larger cities as well, for sure. Now, many of you who were watching my stories and posts when I was in Japan, you saw a young sushi master making sushi for our group in a tea house. And he was lovely. He was so young. He looked like he was 20, but I think he was 30. He trained as a sushi chef, read fish. He trained as a chef, a sushi chef, focusing on fish, but he went vegan and he retrained himself and switched all of his food to be plants. And it was very inspiring because this is very rare and his food was absolutely delicious. The sushi we had with him was probably some of the best I've had, next to Shizen. Like, that's still my favorite sushi, is here in San Francisco. But I can't just recommend where he is because he was someone we hired specific to that, for that experience. So I'll find out more and I'll give you some details, especially if you're a Patreon. I'll follow up. The 5th, I forgot what number I'm on. 5th thing I would say would be, is that 5th? It is, I've lost count. Next would be international cuisine. Now, I know it might sound silly to recommend eating Italian cuisine when you're in Japan, but truthfully, the Japanese love Italian food. And so we even sprinkle some international cuisine into our meals on the trip. And one of my favorite meals was an Italian meal we had. So when I say Italian, this is not just this is really good Italian cuisine. The Japanese love Italian cuisine. They also love Indian cuisine and Middle Eastern. So you will find international cuisine in especially the big cities. And, the Japanese don't eat 100% Japanese cuisine. And so we didn't either on our trips. Like, we also intersperse international cuisine throughout our trips. So it is a thing to have international. It's not so weird. Obviously, you're going to want to enjoy some traditional Japanese cuisine, but you're also going to want to enjoy some international. And you can find that for sure, especially in the cities. And then last but not least, obviously research vegetarian and vegan restaurants in advance. There are vegan restaurants in different cities in Japan. We had some fantastic restaurants. You're going to find that on Happy Cow, TripAdvisor, local blogs, Facebook groups. And as a Patreon, I'm going to give you some of my specifics and I'm going to give you some of my favorites. There's also local organizations and meetups. So veganism in Japan is growing. And because of amazing individuals who are activists in Japan, it's happening. It's growing. There was a time 10 years ago in Paris, we couldn't find anything to eat that wasn't just, kind of second rate, good enough. But my God, Paris has exploded. In France, it's growing. I think we're seeing the very early seeds of this in Japan. Now, it's a different culture. There's going to be challenges. There are these, a real, kind of tension between, tradition and culture in Japan and the concept of veganism, but awareness is growing and the availability of plant-based options, truly plant-based, actual vegan, not animal products, is growing. And I can say that also because when we were in Japan, when we were in Tokyo, as you've experienced in some of our other joyful vegan trips, we try to connect with local activists. And so we had 3 local activists join us at an izakaya in Tokyo, and we did this on both trip 1 and trip 2. Now, izakaya is typically bar food. It's like basically a pub, and it's going to be bar food. Now, there is a vegan izakaya in Tokyo. It's called Izakaya Masaka, and I am still thinking about those chicken balls. I had like there were fried chicken balls, and there were several different kinds of fried chicken balls depending on the sauce. I'm still dreaming about those fried chicken balls. Like, they were so decadent and so naughty and so delicious. And we had 3 wonderful activists from Tokyo meet us and spend time and talk to all of our travelers about what they do and, what they're working on specifically. Taka hosts vegan meetups. I'm now connected with Taka on Instagram, and he's been listening to my podcast. Taka, if you're listening to this, thank you again for all you do, and thanks for listening to the podcast. And it was cute because I saw Taka after the first time we met. I saw him again on our second trip, but he was really cute because in between he clearly found my podcast and listened to it, and I saw him post on his story. He said, oh no, I think you posted on your story, Taka, but then you also sent me a message directly, and you said, I've been listening to your podcast. It's actually pretty good. And I'm like, well, thank you. Thank you. I'm laughing because it was almost like you were surprised that it was good, but I don't know. I mean, you don't know what to expect when you listen to a podcast, and there's so many podcasts these days. So thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I look forward to seeing you again and continuing to see the work that you're doing in Japan. And then Layla, I think it was Layla, who is like one of 2 staff members who work for PETA in Japan. Like, it's growing over there, and then some other activists. So there are just incredible people doing really good work in Japan. And thank you. You are the early adopters. You are the influencers. You are the early seed planters in Japan. And it's because of you. It's because of people like these activists that I think we're going to keep seeing the growth of veganism as a concept in Japan beyond just, it being part of Buddhist culture. And so there were people on the ground helping us. Bridie and Seb raved about this young woman named Alina who helped them so much. And I got to connect with her, obviously, when we were there, and I look forward to staying in touch with her. She's amazing. She's Romanian by birth. She's been in Japan, I don't know, 15 years or something like that, or off and on, but now has residency and is married to, Lena, you're married to a Japanese fella, I think, right? And so she has an absolute passion for all things Japanese. And then when she became vegan, she's really taken that to the next level. And she's part of what's called japanbylocals.com. It's a group of people who really help you create itineraries and plan your trip. So if you don't come on a joyful vegan trip, you can reach out to japanbylocals.com. You can reach out to Alina specifically. She's on Instagram, and I highly recommend you follow her. If you want to ask me what her handle is, please do. It's hard to just say it right here. But if you go to Japan by Locals, you can find Alina, and then you can find her over on Instagram. And Rushka also was someone we met and is also part of Japan by Locals. And it was really fun. I'm going to give Bridie and Seb so much grief about this because they did not tell me about Ruja until like the last night. I found out from Ruja when I met her in person that Ruja was also helping and giving suggestions. And Ruja, I connected Ruja with Bridie and Seb so that they'd have another resource when they were starting to scout and do all the details on Japan. And what I didn't know is that Rusha found me on Clubhouse. So she came into one of my Clubhouse rooms. Remember Clubhouse? I still have fond memories of Clubhouse. And it was so helpful during COVID. So Ruja came in one of my rooms that I was hosting. And I don't know if then I was talking about Japan and my love of Japanese culture. She's Bulgarian by birth, and she lives in Japan, and she's also married to a Japanese gentleman. And she anyway, so she came on, and when I was talking about Japanese culture, and she knew how much I loved it, and I told her that we were thinking about doing a trip there someday, I connected her with Brady and Seb. Well, they didn't even tell me this until like I met Ruja on the trip on the last night. So thank you, Ruja. And you can go find Ruja also. She's also connected with Japan by locals. So I have to tell you that if I say one more word, I'm going to not be coherent, because that was a lot to say in, okay, an hour and a half. I did not expect that to be a 90-minute episode, but it was. And I hope you I hope you enjoyed this episode. I put a lot of thought and a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of research into this, and I hope you experienced that. I hope you can sense that, and I hope you do head over to Patreon, become a supporter, head over to joyfulvegan.com, become a supporter, and make it worth the time, because what I'm sharing with you is not just for you, it's for everybody, and you just don't know how this is going to impact everybody who's listening. And I just hope it gives you some food for thought, not only in understanding, kind of the history of Japan and the history of food in Japan, and kind of understanding the culture a bit more, but also giving you what you need for when you travel to Japan without me and enjoy the experience. Because I'm not even talking about non-food related things in this beautiful country. We had such an incredible time, and there's so much to say, but I wanted to focus on the food. So please reach out if you have any questions. If you are a supporter, just give me a little time. I'm going to be sending over some more details, and I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Like I said, I can't say anymore because I'm not going to be coherent for the animals. This is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.